Okay, hey Adam, good to see you.
Hi, David.
I like your background, whatever it looks like long leaves of they're sort of blurred and green, so that's nice to
Yeah,
see.
I
Um,
thought a nice summary picture in the background.
okay, well, thank you. So I wanted to talk to you about a couple of things, and we had talked for quite a long time after about your experience being on the NICE committee for the new guidelines, and so those came out at the end of October. So we talked after that. And so I'm wondering what you think about the impact those have had in the last not quite a year, or if they've had an impact and what you see the impact being.
I definitely think there has been an impact. I am noticing that people are referring to the guidelines. We're seeing that clinics are changing the information that they've got out there because of the guidelines. And obviously, Sajid Javid announced a big process to look at how we can implement the guidelines and make sure that they are fully adhered to across the NHS. So I think that we are seeing movement on that. And I think we're even starting to see movement in terms of the Royal Colleges as well. My understanding is that the charities have been in touch with some of them and they are looking at how they can implement training to, bring themselves up to date. So
let's put that in context for just a second. The Royal Colleges you're referring to that was that there was a lot of pushback when the guidelines were released and before they were released from I guess three or four of the Royal Colleges, some more than others, against the guidelines, and they issued a statement, several of them, after the guidelines were out, that they didn't agree with some of them, and so on and so forth. And so we know there's been also vocal opposition, and from other individual practitioners and PACE authors, let's say. So there has been sort of a somewhat organized pushback against it. But so you think that behind the scenes, there's been discussions going on?
I think that they have. I think some of them have been positive. I'm not sure about who was pushing back against the guidelines, but I'm sure that there are people still doing that. But my understanding is that the Royal College of GPs, the Royal College of Occupational Therapists, a few of the Royal Colleges have had conversations with the UK charities. So I think that there is some growing acceptance that, if they're not changing yet, that they're going to have to change eventually to keep up to date with what's going on. And I think that's very positive, and that gives us a little bit of hope, I think, because it means that things might change. Obviously, I don't think it's going to be an easy path, and I think you still have to drill things into people, because I think at some level people still can't wrap their head around the fact that exercise can be a problem for this patient group. And so I think some people will think, oh, but exercise is fine, we just need to do it, in the right amount or whatever. And those people probably are going to need more attention to kind of get the message, because they might be people who think, oh yeah, graded exercise therapy is terrible because it's all fixed and it doesn't tailor it to the person. But that's kind of only getting part of the message through, and those people might be very well meaning and therefore think that they're doing the right thing, but they might actually be causing harm because of that. So I think we need to be really careful about people like that, as well as the people that are going to just ignore the guidelines and do what they want to do anyway.
Have you gotten any sense from other patients that the guidelines have been helpful in terms of their own clinical experience? That it's come down yet to the level of individual doctors having heard something or being more sympathetic than they might have been?
Yeah, I've definitely seen individual patients have said that they've had positive experiences because of the new guidelines. There has been a problem that's not been universal, and I still don't think that's the majority experience. I still think that is the exception rather than the rule, but we are seeing it more often than we saw it before. I think one of the barriers is that when you go to a GP, a general practitioner, they're usually so busy, and they probably have a load of patients coming in every day saying, oh, have you read this thing that I've downloaded off the internet that I printed off for you, So I think getting them to actually engage with it is in itself a bit of a barrier. But even beyond that, you know, in terms of the clinics, we're still seeing that some of the clinics are putting out incorrect information, or they claim that they are offering the right information, but actually when you hear from patients who are receiving it, it's still more of the same, just dressed up.
Right, and we've
So
seen that some of the discussions online, or some of the things I posted, or patients have pointed out, and Charles Shepard from the ME Association has written to some of the trusts that still have, you know, outdated guidelines, let's say, on their sites.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that happens, because I was on the NICE guideline and I'm quite sort of visible on Twitter, is people always tag me in these things. So I do see that they're happening. And Charles is probably a bit fed up, because every time I get tagged in something, I email it to Charles, and Charles was probably already dealing with it 2 days before, you know. But it means that we can keep each other up to date, because actually Charles is quite good. He tells me, oh, this is what we've been working on, this is where we're up to with this. And he often knows things that I don't, because he's working, you know, with those trusts, or maybe he's spoken directly to patients and he's got like more than the Twitter soundbite of what's actually happened, because obviously when you're looking at a series of tweets, you might not get the full picture. So he's been really, really useful at kind of giving context for that. And it does look positive in general. I think one of the most positive things is that now that we do have the NICE guidelines on our side, people like Charles can now email in and say, your information is wrong, you need to update it. And they're really, really quick at getting back and responding. Whereas previously they could have just said, well, look, it's in line with the NICE guidelines, we can do what we want. And now there seems to be a bit more of an acknowledgement that they need to be in line with the guidelines. And I'm not sure whether that's coming from clinics or whether it's coming from the trusts themselves, but it doesn't really matter, I guess, because if the trusts realise that actually their clinics need to be updating, then that puts a bit of top-down pressure on them, I think, to modernise, and that can be helpful.
Well, I think that's, I guess, one thing that I guess that example illustrates, that it's not just the guidance is there, but the guidance that needs to be, or can be used as a advocacy tool, I guess, or as a way to bring attention to change in the actual fields, as opposed to it just sort of magically sprinkling down on top of the medical field like, you know, fairy dust.
Exactly. And I keep saying to people, you know, in the past, it was like we were fighting the establishment. We're fighting all the systems because everything was against us. And now it's kind of the opposite. Like, we are now, you know, we are advocating for the establishment position. We're just asking people to actually, you know, to actually do what they're supposed to be doing. So we've got NICE on side. We've got the CDC, you know, quietly, but they have updated their guidelines. We've got the NAM report, of IOM as it was. So we now have, you know, we're starting to gain critical mass in terms of establishment organisations saying what patients have been saying for a long time. And that does change the power dynamic, I think, and it makes it a bit easier for us going forwards.
So let's going forward. So what is the role of the sort of around the same time within the last couple of months, we had the report from the All-Party Parliamentary Group led by Carol Monahan. And we also had the announcement by former health minister of the government, Sajid Javid, sorry, announcing his task force, which you were then going to be part of. So why don't you talk about what both those initiatives and what the minister's resignation means for that, and, you know, who knows how long the government would be in power. So anyway, yeah, why don't you just talk about those going forward? And I apologize to the minister for mangling his name.
It's okay. I mean, I don't expect you as an American to necessarily keep up with all the names of our politicians, especially because we've had quite a few of them popping in and out of roles in the last few years.
And we're facing we had a coup attempt, and we're facing another coup in 2024. So I've been back in the U.S. For 2 weeks, and I'm back immersed in U.S. politics. So I forget.
Yeah, exactly. So there's enough going on, I think, on both sides to keep that sort of thing tricky. But I think in general it is positive, because the All-Party Parliamentary Group obviously is across all the parties. So it's not just something that the Conservatives are leading with, or that the Labour Party is leading with. So it does mean that, even if we end up with quite different people in charge in a few months or a couple of years even, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to start afresh. I think the all-party parliamentary groups do have to, reform after a new parliament is sort of called in. But there has been a level of continuity as far as I'm concerned. Carol Monaghan's been involved with ME for a while now, for quite a few years. Right. So and before the last election. So I think that does mean that there is cross-party support for getting this right and changing things. So
but does that mean that it's an issue that's not really in political play between the parties, or as a competitive kind of issue, that it's really something that at least the ones who are members of the committee are not viewing through a political lens specifically, although maybe in ways they might implement it, but in general, that the issue is not viewed as a political issue. It's viewed more just as a healthcare issue in this case.
Exactly. And unlike certain books, Behind the Hype, as I call it, Beyond the Hype It Is by Fiona Fox, right. Making out that this is a huge politicized issue and everything, but actually all the politicians are actually speaking mainly from the same hymn sheet. So it's not really as politicized and divided as people like to make out. It's really just a small group of people who are on one side that have an undue level of influence and an undue platform to speak or whatever, that have made it seem as if it's a very divisive issue, but I don't think it really is. So the Department of Health and Social Care, obviously, they've now taken on the project of how they can implement this guideline. They haven't published all of the details yet. Sorry, go on, David.
Mm-hmm. So basically, he initiated it, announced that a close relative of his has ME, and that was kind of part of the impetus, plus the guideline. And he mentioned that the guideline was part of the impetus. And so then what happened after that? He resigned within a month, I guess it was probably. And so has the new minister done anything in this, or is the process in abeyance until the new minister figures out what to do? Or what is the process, since you were named to be on I forget which group you were on?
I'm on the Attitudes and Education subgroup. So the official information, as far as we have it in the public domain, is that this is going ahead and that the next health minister is committed to it. It doesn't really matter whether the next health minister is committed to it and whether he gets distracted or whether he resigns in a month or two as well, because as tends to happen with these things, is the politician comes up with the initiative, and then they get civil servants essentially to do it, or bureaucrats, and the bureaucrats don't necessarily change between different regimes. So it doesn't matter whether someone else is going to come in who's got completely different views. They've kind of set those bureaucrats off on their task, and they're going to go off and they're going to do it. So I feel reasonably confident that it's going to complete, that the process will complete, and that changes in political climate won't really have an impact on that. What gets done as a result of that, that will be a different matter. But I think the report, the work that we're going to do, the recommendations that we make, that will all happen regardless of who's in power. Obviously, when the results are kind of published, when the findings are published and the recommendations are made, then it does depend who is in power, because they would then have the power on how to implement that, and different parties might have a different approach to doing that, and that may be where we see an issue. But again, it's not been a hugely contentious issue in Parliament. Indeed, what we've actually seen is when we've seen the debates in Parliament, people have just stood up one after the other to just sort of reiterate the same things that they're all saying, because they all have so many constituents writing into them saying exactly the same thing, that actually they all tend to say the same thing, and then the health minister just says, oh, well, the NICE guideline says this, but that's it, you know.
Do you think that that the debate has been influenced not just by the NICE guidelines, or perhaps the NICE guidelines were themselves influenced by the long COVID situation? So do you think that even though the NICE guide, you know, there's been, people have sort of perceived that as, oh, this is related to that, and that's kind of given an impetus to this?
Yeah, so I don't think it could make much of a difference to the guideline that we wrote for NICE, just because most of it was already written by the time long COVID kind of happened, which is hard to imagine because it happened so long ago now, but the whole thing was such a huge process. It did have some factors in terms of when we were thinking about how quickly we wanted to see people, and the fact that we thought that there would be increased resource costs. But I think there has been a wider recognition from other people that, oh, actually, yeah, these things look similar. And I think that has made people a bit more aware of ME in a way that they weren't before, or people knew about it, but they didn't know very much. They weren't very well informed about it, but we're seeing lots of information out about long COVID. And I think part of that is that the general awareness of ME has become a little bit better. And I think in terms of medics, a lot of medics are now seeing, you know, clinicians are seeing their friends and colleagues falling down ill with COVID, and then many of them getting long COVID. And I think that changes things as well, because it increases empathy. They're realizing, oh, you know, it's not just hysterical patients, or it's not just, you know, difficult people. It's people like us. We could get this too, you know. And then I think that makes it more real for them. And it, you know, if you're a busy clinician who's never met a person with ME properly, or you've never had time to properly engage with them, all you might see is them in a really short period of time in that consultation, where they might be under a lot of stress, or they might be very nervous because they've had a lot of negative experiences beforehand, and that might skew your perception of that patient group, and so you might not actually understand them properly. Whereas when it's your friends and colleagues and you can have an in-depth conversation, you then pick up on lots of nuances, lots of details, and things that you wouldn't have picked up before.
You mean things like post-exertional malaise or that kind of thing?
Exactly, that kind of thing. But also, I think, you know, there has been that stereotype that we are malingerers, or that, you know, it's psychosomatic or whatever. Yeah. And I think if somebody turns up and they are genuinely anxious because they've had really bad negative encounters with clinicians before, then you might read that as, oh, this is evidence that they are, you know, psychosomatic, because it, you know, it's that you're looking for what you already assume to be true. Whereas if you're meeting people who are your friends and you're realizing, oh, actually, yeah, this person isn't it's not psychosomatic. This person actually isn't anxious. I can see that the impact of their illness. And also when you go in and it's that, you know, 8-minute consultation time, they're going to see you when you're well enough to leave the house. So they're not going to see you at your worst. Whereas if it's a friend or family member, then they might do. Yeah. Right.
I think the other thing that struck me as a problem in the UK, in the NHS, is that people, it sounds like, tend to go see whichever GP is on call, you know, is available at the surgery, and so they don't actually have one person who's really invested and knows them and has seen them over the years. And it's unusual. I mean, here in the US, if you have, you know, good health insurance, you have a primary care doctor, and it's not a general practice where there's 7 doctors. It's one primary care doctor, you know, who knows you and who knows you from, you know, year to year, and so is a better judge of, you know, he knows you're not malingering you, or he knows, well, you're normally really robust, what's happened. And so it's not just a rotating cycle of people who might stereotype you on the first instant if they don't actually know you.
Exactly. And I think there's a bit of a problem in that in those 8-minute consultations, or however long it is now, they're expected to read your notes, get up to date with everything, and then find out what's currently going wrong. And there's often a lot of time wasted, like repeating things, which can be quite frustrating for you or for them, and it can make one or both of you feel a bit defensive, and it's not an ideal situation. I think it would be great if you could see the same person every single time. I know that at my GP surgery, I can try to do that, but it means I might have to wait a month or 6 weeks to get an appointment with the same person. Whereas if I want an appointment immediately, you know, within the next week or two, which is still quite difficult, then I have to go with whoever's available.
But within this system, that's sort of what you would like to focus on in terms of education and training. I mean, that's part of the bailiwick for that, right? Is to work with medical training as medical education as well as general education.
Yeah, so actually, in terms of education, we're looking really broadly at that. So we're looking at social work, we're looking at education, you know, schools, universities. We are looking at the healthcare profession as well, obviously. And we've kind of touched on, you know, public attitudes and public awareness and how those might feed into things. It's still all early days, so I can't say what the final outcome of all of that will be and whether there'll be some narrowing down of that scope as things go along. But it seems to me that the issues are all interwoven. People have complicated problems with school. They have it when they go to the doctor. They have it with social workers. So it's a very institutionalized problem, I would say, in that we engage with these things in every part of our life. So if we are going to make a change, then there needs to be changes to attitudes and education more widely, I think.
Mm-hmm. And so that's one group of the ministerial project. Is that group? What are the other groups that are meeting?
I think there's a research group, which are looking at research, obviously, and then I think there's a Living with ME group who are going to look at how we can make things better for people in their day-to-day lives when they're living with ME.
And was there a timetable set up for when these processes were going to get get finished by, or when you were supposed to have recommendations at some point?
I think we're looking at a year or two. So it's not something that's going to be
Imminent.
super short term. I think it's going to be something that's going to take some time to do. The meetings are not very long. Obviously, we need to include people with ME and their carers, so that means we, need to be a bit flexible. I think all the meetings we're aiming for are going to be an hour or two at most. So that obviously makes things take a little longer.
Okay, well, listen, I think we sort of had a good recap. Anything else that you want to add in this general realm of discussion that I haven't asked?
Well, I guess one of the things that that I hope that we can do through the Department of Health and Social Care is when we're looking at attitudes and education, we can make sure that it's the right education, that it includes patient voices, and we would like that in schools, like that in local authorities, in government. We'd like that in clinical practice as well, just because all these things feed together, and it's not just a problem with people accessing healthcare, it's also things like threats of social services, people being sectioned, so being held under the Mental Health Act against their will. And, there's people have so many problems accessing education. There isn't proper provision set up for them. So I think part of that will be about informing people about the legal responsibilities that they already have. And some of it will also be about just making them aware generally about how better to meet people's needs.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Adam. It's good to see you again.
Thank you, David. It's always a pleasure.
Okay, so we can sign off. You're doing the recording, so you can end the conversation now.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.